Yes, exactly. Can you talk me through a little bit why some of the other answers are not right? And you can get help from your teammates too. So let's start with patients who are on hospice or receiving palliative care.
When they're on hospice or receiving palliative care, I don't think they're on active treatment, correct? It's just supportive care.
Exactly. That is exactly right. So it would be highly unethical unless you're basically looking at like a palliative care treatment specifically to improve their quality of life. That would be a little bit different. But most of these treatments, especially if they're against their disease, are not going to be appropriate for patients. And on hospice, exactly, patients are not receiving any more treatment. What about if the standard of therapy is prohibitively expensive? I mean, cost is important, right?
But, I think at the same time, still, you wouldn't be comparing that to a placebo just because of cost. I'm pretty sure there are reimbursement methods.
Yep, you are absolutely right. We should never, ever, ever, change the way we treat patients entirely based on cost. So cost obviously factors in maybe for the selection of treatments or selection of patients specific to a therapy, but we would never want to just decide, well, we're going to see if the science works because we don't want to pay this much for this drug. So absolutely right. And what about the standard of therapy is extremely toxic?
I think honestly, most of the therapies, especially with oncology, they are toxic. It's just risk versus benefits at this point.
You're absolutely right. So, again, it may be an added benefit that the active drug that you're looking at is less toxic, and hopefully it's less toxic than the standard therapy. And that's actually one of the reasons why a lot of the like nivolumab, pembrolizumab, really why these drugs got approved in the first place, because they often compared them to really toxic drugs and like carboplatin, cisplatin. And then because it had a different set of side effects, the manufacturers would say things like, see, this is a less toxic drug than cisplatin. And that's not true. I mean, we know that that's not true. But unfortunately, they can get away with it because they can say, well, but it doesn't cause nausea. Mm-hmm. Well, but it doesn't cause febrile neutropenia, right? It doesn't cause anemia. So those are the things that we look at that we provide supportive care on that we assume are very expensive to the system and are also really tough for quality of life. So exactly right. Thank you. I appreciate that. All right. So for the next question, a researcher thinks that she has found a novel targeted therapy for a newly identified mutation in non-small cell lung cancer patients. Cisplatin is considered the typical treatment for the subset of patients. In order to ensure that all patients in her randomized controlled trial receive care that is ethical, how should she design the trial? So what do you guys think?
B.
Yeah, and can you tell me why?
It's basically just like because you already know cisplatin works, so you can't just like not give one group cisplatin. So, and like, because you don't really know if the novel drug will even work or not. So to be ethical, you have to be able to treat both of them.
Exactly. Now, the only reason where you might not do that would be if you knew already that a drug interaction existed between the two, right? Or that like some additive toxicity would really affect the safety profile. But in general, on average, when we're especially looking at like novel targets, we can combine therapies. And that's one of the problems that's happened when you look at, for example, again, some of the checkpoint inhibitors, right? So if you see a lot of them are like, oh, it's placebo controlled, or there's some other drug that they're calling standard of therapy, but they're not giving it in addition to, or, maybe it's actually not the true standard of therapy. And we'll talk about that when we talk about one of the checkmate trials. So that's exactly right. Now, if there were no standard of treatment, then placebo versus a novel drug would be reasonable, right? So that would be the only other really good option. Or if, for example, the novel drug had a related, so if the novel drug were maybe, let's say, related to cisplatin, right? And there was some duplication in, therapeutic duplication where we wouldn't want to combine those two, then maybe it would be appropriate to do cisplatin versus the novel drug. But if you have an entirely different drug target, it's not necessarily like the idea is to replace the drug or add it, then, we want to do this kind of combination. Did everybody understand that? Awesome. Payments to investigators, this is my favorite. Payments to investigators by pharmaceutical companies for non-research related activities do not have ethical implications for the integrity of randomized controlled trials. Is that true or false? See a little hesitation here. What do you guys think? You know about
this? It's false.
It's false. Yeah. Can you tell me a little bit about why that might be true? I mean, why what you said is it's true.
Because it like inputs some type of bias into the study, because you're paying the investigators, so they'll essentially say whatever makes it look good.
Yes, you are very correct, and it's so concerning that probably about 5 years ago, maybe a little bit longer, they started instituting the Sunshine Act. Are you guys familiar with the Sunshine Act from law or ethics? Okay, that's not good. That's actually a really, really, really important law for you guys to be aware of. So my only request is when we're done today, please, please, please look up the Sunshine Act, because it's one of the ways in which they're trying to address this issue specifically. This is not an only oncology issue. This is an across the board. This is why very expensive cardiovascular drugs or anti-diabetic drugs that really don't have any additional benefit are being prescribed. Same thing with a lot of other primary care medications, because providers are getting, and specifically physicians are getting, major payouts from pharmaceutical companies. They also sometimes will get reimbursed, or they will get paid for, rewarded for consulting and things like that, especially if their area is prescribing a lot more of a particular drug. So even though we have the anti-Stark kickback laws and Stark anti-kickback laws and things like that, there are ways around it. And one of the things that is really concerning is that pharmaceutical companies will do what are called advisory boards. Now, I've participated in a number of them, and as a pharmacist, my participation is very different than, for example, like a physician. So when they have physicians come in for advisory boards, they give them a bunch of data that basically encourages them to use a drug without full data. So they'll present, interim analysis or other, upcoming pipeline data and say, so would you consider using these drugs in your patient population? We have free drug programs, and, we can get you whatever drugs you need for your patient if you want to try your patient on these drugs. Well, you're now running your own clinical trial without any input from the FDA or any medical monitoring or any of that stuff, right? So this happens constantly in oncology, and it's the bane of my existence, because money really does drive research. And in this case, often money drives data. And that should never be how we get data. So one of the other things about the Sunshine Act, if you are interested in finding out how much a particular physician made off of a pharmaceutical company, they do have to disclose it, right? And they also have to disclose, like, if they were given meals and, hotel reimbursements, travel, things like that. You can look up physicians in this database, and you can actually see how much money they made. Many of the oncologists I've seen on clinical trials, things like that, are making hundreds of thousands of dollars extra from pharmaceutical companies. They already get paid on average between $600,000 and $800,000. So if that doesn't make you angry, it really is very problematic. So then the other part of this discussion, why this is tough, is that sometimes they'll also get rewarded for getting pharmacists to add drugs onto the formulary, right? Because in order to add a drug to the formulary, you got to get through the pharmacist. Well, we often don't know what their impetus is. They'll come up and they'll say, oh, hey, I've got a patient, we're out of options. Like, there's this one option. What do you think? And usually I'll say, well, show me the data. And they'll show me the data, and it's crappy data, or it's like not enough data. And I'll say, no, that really doesn't make sense. And then they'll push, and then all of a sudden maybe it'll get approved, like accelerated approval. And then they come back to me. They're like, look, it's approved. And so if it gets added, inevitably, I'll end up seeing them providing a dinner talk, a few weeks later, where they get paid, and they get paid like $5,000 for an hour long sit down with a bunch of colleagues where they're basically shooting the shit with each other. So, again, this is a really big issue. And it's not that people are trying to be unethical. I really don't believe that the vast majority of the physicians and, other prescribers who are taking in money from pharmaceutical companies, I'm not saying that they're unethical or that they're knowingly doing this. But as Emily pointed out, this potentially increases the risk of bias, and it's unconscious bias, right? So maybe the investigator is looking at an IRAE for a checkpoint inhibitor and is like, well, but it could be because somebody had bad salad, like they may not think that that's a big deal, but they're potentially not reporting an adverse event because they're less willing to question the status quo or challenge it, right? Because there's a financial incentive to not do that. So anyway, that was a long, winding way of saying that that's absolutely categorically false. So thank you. But look up the Sunshine Act. That's really important because you can look up literally any physician. So which of the following must be communicated to human subject participants in a randomized controlled trial? This should be a pretty easy one. Not everybody at once. Please raise your hand. I'm just kidding.
They can withdraw at any time.
That's right. They can withdraw from any time. And when we're consenting a patient, we really have to, like, every time we explain to them, okay, you're going to be expected to do this, you're going to be expected to do that, but understand that you can withdraw at any time for any reason. The patients don't have to give us a reason either. So I would also encourage you, if some of you decide to become investigational drug pharmacists, make sure that you let patients know, hey, for our learning, it would be great if you could talk to us about why you're withdrawing, so that we can relay that back to the manufacturer, if there's a quality of life issue here. But you never want to push, because patients often don't withdraw from studies because they're afraid that it's going to compromise their care if they're staying with the same providers. Because again, it's that unconscious bias potentially that a provider could be irritated that they had this this patient in a trial and then they pulled out. Incidentally, physicians get paid by participants in trials and for participating in a trial, being an investigator. So they also have a financial incentive to enroll patients. One of the other things that's interesting is that physicians will get paid just to open a study, even if they never enroll a single patient. So unfortunately, what you'll see is a lot of providers will open up a ton of studies, get a bunch of paychecks, and then won't necessarily accrue or enroll a patient in a trial. So look out for that too when you're, at an institution where you're doing clinical trials. And the gathering of data for science will trump individual patient or investigator concerns about safety or efficacy. That should never be the case, right? The patient should always trump everything. All right. Some of the issues involving interim analyses of data during a randomized control trial may include select all of the following, or select all that apply, rather. So what do you guys think? How about the first one? Lack of appropriate information given to participants over safety or efficacy concerns. Is that possible?
Yep.
Okay. What about increased cost for researchers? Do we care about that? We don't care about that. It is more costly to do an interim analysis because you have to pool the data, you have to get a statistician, you have to look at like, you know, seeing if you've met some kind of maybe an interim endpoint, but that we don't care about that. How about accelerated approval granted and widespread clinical adoption without overall survival, progression-free survival, or quality of life data? Is that possible? That's probable. That's like basically how most of the checkpoint inhibitors got approved, to be perfectly honest with you, at least in the beginning. Now we're starting to see really more robust phase 3 trials, but interim analyses were really what kind of pushed Keytruda and nivolumab and, you know, these other drugs into the market. Overstatement of efficacy for the active treatment arm without complete data. Is that a possibility? Yeah, so a drug might look like it's really working, but you only have one slice of the data. So without actually completing the trial, it's really hard to know, again, if it remains as efficacious. Maybe its efficacy wanes over time. And especially with the monoclonal antibodies, we know that there's some level of immunogenicity associated with them, right? It's a big molecule, it bumps around your veins, your body creates its own immune response, and it can create neutralizing antibodies. So some of these drugs really do lose their efficacy over time. And you won't necessarily see that, and you won't necessarily have a Kaplan-Meier curve either that finally shows them having like a crossover event, right? With the placebo or the conventional arm with the new therapy. So anyway, these are some of the things that I want you to be able to really critically look at when you look at studies. And this is not just germane to oncology. This is really important for every area of pharmacy and medicine, because the data is still generated the same way. Even if there are more patients available for cardiovascular studies, diabetic studies than there are for some of the cancers, because we just don't have the numbers. And it's hard to encourage very sick people or to encourage people to enroll in a clinical trial for oncology, because patients often feel like, well, this is an experimental drug and it may not work, so I don't want to take that risk. And ideally, patients really should only be entering into these trials when there is actually decent data to support what's being done, right? And presumably that came from the phase 1 trial and maybe even some of the phase 2 data. I would say that by and large, a lot of the community centers, so not academic institutions, but community hospitals, probably do participate more in like phase 3 trials. They definitely don't do phase 1. So phase 1 trials are, and even to some extent phase 2 trials, tend to be done more at academic institutions because they often will have to draw like kinetics data, and they'll have to do more complicated labs. They may also have more arms of a trial, and they have the resources to support that, whereas a community hospital or community center really doesn't necessarily have that ability. So in general, again, you'll see more phase 3 studies done in community settings. Does anybody have any questions about that before I give you guys a quick break and then we start chatting about our findings from the articles? You guys find this interesting, hopefully? Okay, that's good. It's important, I promise. This will help you for your rotations. I know I keep saying that, and you won't believe me until at some point next year, and then you'll be like, oh yeah, that's why she pushed us to do this stuff. Okay, I'm going to give you guys, is a 5-minute break okay? Okay, you guys a 5-minute break, and then we'll move on to the articles. So please be prepared to chat. I'm not talking. I want to hear what you guys have to say. Your voices are important. Okay, awesome. All right, I'll see you guys back in about 5 minutes.